Jon, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Kristen. It's nice to be back.
Second appearance here. So for any of our new listeners or anybody that maybe didn't hear your first episode in season 1, tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do.
Okay, so I am an executive and team coach based in Paris. I was born in the US, and I've been living in Paris now for 13 years. Started my career here, but I wasn't always an executive and team coach. For 10 years, I was a lawyer. So for some of those years, I was working in big law firms doing international dispute resolution. And then for some of those years, I was working in-house at an intergovernmental organization.
Nice. So the topic that we're going to be talking about today is pretty close to your heart, because I know this was an experience that you went through. And this is kind of what you coach other people around. This is kind of like your niche area, right?
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't necessarily say it's an experience I went through in the sense that maybe it was something I wish I had done a little bit more of.
Okay.
I guess I would put it that way.
Fair.
But yeah, it's definitely a topic that I coach people in for sure.
Okay, so let's dive into it. So what we're going to be talking about today is getting to that point in your career where you feel maybe disconnected from it. You're not getting as much meaning or satisfaction, fulfillment from it, and feeling like you might want to explore some other paths, or like you and I did at one point, take the nuclear option and just like drop that like a bad habit and pick up something else to run with it. So kind of tell me a little bit about what your clients, when they come to you, kind of what are some of the things that you hear from them?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question. I guess I'd like to preface that by saying the reason why I really wanted to talk about this topic is because so I, as a coach, I don't work with people on changing careers, career transitions, looking for new jobs. What I do work with people on is how to thrive in their current position. And it's an important point to make because a lot of people only associate coaching with career change. And I actually get a lot of people who come to me and they say, look, I've had it with my job. I can't deal with it anymore. Please, help me find something new. And at that point, I have to give people, I guess, sort of two pieces of bad news. The first piece of bad news is that, look, that's not something that I really work on. And the second piece of bad news is that actually a lot of the problems that you're experiencing right now are probably not going to be solved by taking that nuclear option of changing jobs or changing careers. Mm-hmm. But I guess then the good news that I can give people is that, but a lot of people actually do manage to figure out ways to thrive and be really happy in their job by making a series of adjustments.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of reasons, like root causes almost, of why this comes up for people. I know like it happened for me kind of mid career. That seems to be kind of a time that is pretty common for it to happen with people. So what do you think is kind of like the root of what these people are feeling?
I think there are a couple of things that are happening in parallel. So on the one hand, we change a lot as we grow older, as we advance in our careers. So our priorities might shift, our interests might change a little bit, the way that we see the world might change a little bit. Then on the other hand, our jobs also change. So as we're advancing through the ranks, one of the things that typically happens is that we take on more and more management responsibilities. And so when we first started working, maybe what really interested us were the really technical aspects of our job, the analysis or, what have you of the work. Whereas as you get higher and higher in the hierarchy, again, the emphasis gets taken away from that sometimes, and you're really more about managing teams and everything. And even though that's the standard trajectory, that doesn't necessarily correspond with the interest of most people. And then so what you have happen is that sometimes because of these two parallel processes that are happening, you can actually get pretty far away from, your job gets further and further away, I guess, from what your ideal at that moment is. And then so all of a sudden you can wake up one day and realize, oh man, hold on a second. I hate going to work. I don't have as much energy as I did. I'm bored at work. A huge thing as well is people saying, when I leave my job at the end of the day, I can't stop thinking about work.
Mm.
Because, they have all these things that are hanging over their head, and maybe they're even, I had a client I was working with recently, and I remember when we first started working together, one of the things she said was basically from midday on Sunday, her mood just totally changed, because then all of a sudden she realized, oh man, the weekend's over and now I have to get ready to go back to work on Monday.
The Sunday scaries. That's what we
Yeah.
call them. It's a real thing, it does. It's like it starts to creep in. You're like, oh man, here it comes, re-entry. So I think that brings up a really good point. And I know that I'd also kind of shared with you another kind of perspective on this, is that as we kind of get to mid-career, making that shift from the fluid intelligence curve where we're young and we're innovative and we're on that hedonic treadmill, and then getting to a point in life where we kind of want to be more on the crystallized intelligence, using our wisdom in our job, the experience that we've gained over all these years. But I'm curious as to, like, with your job when you were an attorney, what were the feelings that you had that made you look at this and say, like, I need to make a change in this environment?
I think it was a lot of things that were happening. I think when I really started, I guess there were a couple of changes that I made. I mean, my first change was leaving my law firm. That was a number of things, just kind of realizing that where I was didn't really correspond with what my interests were. It was a rhythm of work and life that was extremely demanding, and I didn't necessarily have the same level of interest in the field I was working in as all of my colleagues. And I thought, probably worth it for them to be kind of making the sort of sacrifices they're making for their life, but for me, it just didn't really make a lot of sense. Also, really, really high levels of stress, and when you're not super interested in what you're doing, I guess it can even be more stressful, because again, it's something you start to dread instead of really just sort of enjoying it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess the second change I made when I made my sort of full career change, from being a lawyer to being a coach, it was really more just boredom. It was a lot of, I'd felt like I was seeing the same questions coming up at work that I'd already kind of dealt with before, so things weren't as novel as they had been. There were also a number of things going on in the world at that point that were influencing in a sort of global political way the work I was doing, and so it became frustrating in ways that were really kind of demotivating.
Mm-hmm.
And then also I just got to a point in my career where I realized that I wanted to have a little bit more responsibility. I wanted to have more control than I did. And I was working at a place that was very hierarchical. And based on the way that the department was structured, it was going to be really difficult to kind of move up in the way that I really felt like I needed to in order to kind of realize my full potential. And so for me, at least, going out and working for myself made a lot of sense. And so I was able to find this line of work that allowed me to do that. I think one of the things that, that's actually relevant to this discussion is that when I was really thinking about making my career change, I thought about all of the things that I really loved about my job and all the things that I really didn't. And by the way, I'm sort of making it sound like this was a quick decision. I guess it's important to keep in mind that it took me about 2 years to get through this decision-making process. I realized that I could keep all of the things that I really loved about my job, and I could get rid of all of the things that I really hated by doing coaching.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's nice when you have, like, when you are able to find a path that's clear to a new career transition in that sense, but not everybody has that option, which is why I love the approach that you take of, like, let's look at your current job and how can we tweak this to better fit so that it feels like a better fit for you. And I really like that you want to drop the passion narrative around, like, you need to follow your passion or pursue your passion or do work that you're passionate about. Speak more to that.
So I think a lot of us are taught this really dangerous narrative that we're supposed to be extremely passionate about our work, and that everyone is able to monetize what they're passionate in. So I know tons of people, for example, I'm thinking of friends who are artists who, it's really difficult to make a living in that type of work. And so they have jobs that pay the bills, and then alongside that they do things that really that are their true passion. I think that there are people in this world who are really passionate about their work, But I think that that's definitely the minority, and I don't think that that's what we should be so focused on. And I think that there are so many ways to get satisfaction out of one's job without having it be that, oh, this is my passion, or, oh, this is the thing that gets me most intellectually stimulated.
Yeah. I almost feel like in a sense that the passion and fulfillment or meaning, they kind of like, we conflate those a little bit. Like they're supposed to be the same thing, but they're actually two very different. Like you could have something you're very passionate about that you're pursuing outside of work, and that's going to be very fulfilling for you to pursue that passion, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that has to be the case in work. There's two separate, like almost spheres of life, that is, as long as we're pursuing our passions, whether that be in our outside of work life or in our work life, for those that are lucky enough to do that, as long as you're pursuing it, that's the point. It doesn't necessarily have to be in this one like area of life.
Yeah, and also, it's thinking about things from a work-life balance perspective as well. Doing a job that you're passionate again, it could be great, but it also can be really dangerous, in the sense that it then can really become all-consuming, and that can seem really great for a really long time, but then it might become exclusive of everything else. I mean, think about people who are, musicians, right? That have huge amounts of success and are touring all around the world all the time. Yeah, you think about that, it's really glamorous and really exciting, but then you actually think about what their lives are and you think, okay, well, they don't get to see their friends all the time. They get to see their family very rarely. Maybe they don't even really have the opportunity to create and cultivate a stable group of friends or create a family. So living out your passion can really be a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
And also there are so many, we're all really complex beings. There are so many ways in which we're fulfilled. Uh, there are many of us have a lot of different interests. And so thinking about all those different components of ourselves and not necessarily focusing on, okay, what is my one passion? What is that one thing? But thinking about all the different ways that we can get satisfaction and which of those things we might be able to get from work, which might be different from the things that would seem immediately obvious, can help us to figure out how to get some balance and how to be happy in our professional lives.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've kind of seen a different outtake on that too. Friends that have pursued a passion as their career, and then because of the burnout, like lost the passion for the thing that they had so much passion for, because it at some point became work, and it was work that they weren't enjoying. So instead of just letting that passion be something that was very fulfilling in their life, it was like they kind of took it to the extreme and like burned themselves out on it.
Yeah, and going back to what I was saying earlier about how we change and develop throughout our lives and throughout our careers, something that is our passion when we're younger might not at all be once we get a little bit older. And conversely, we might actually find out that we have a passion for something completely different as we do get a little bit older. So, I gave the example of people who take on management responsibility and that takes them further away from what they're interested in. But it could very well be the opposite. You find people who, for example, thinking about my clients, I can think of a couple who, uh, really excited about what they do as lawyers, but also as they get older, they get super excited about cultivating their teams, inspiring the next generation, uh, creating an environment for their teams in which everyone can learn and grow and get along together, and helping people to work on that and really develop those maybe unexpected. Like I said, I'm trying not to use the word passion, but those unexpected areas of interest can be another way to help people get a lot out of their work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you kind of mentioned too, like as we grow, as we change, our values sometimes change. And so we can get to these later aspects of our career, mid-career, and our values are very different than what they were when we maybe started this career path. And that misalignment can cause almost that cognitive dissonance too, where it's like it feels off because I'm not in alignment with my values. How often do you see that?
I think that's pretty common because as we grow older, as we get a little bit wiser, maybe certain things that were important to us become less important. I think also when we're younger, we can get tricked into thinking that we do value things we don't necessarily value so much. Things that I'm thinking about here, at the top of the list are money and prestige. I think once you get a little bit older, once you get a little bit more distance on things, you can realize that you really start to internalize the fact that, okay, money is a means to an end. What is it that I'm actually looking for out of my job? What are the things that I'm actually buying with the money that I'm getting? Is there some sort of shortcut to that? Maybe might I be able to get some satisfaction for my job that I don't need to pay people for? Or, is that prestige really important? What am I really getting out of it? Could I maybe be, angling my career in a slightly different way, or less focus on getting to a certain point in my career or at a certain place, because maybe I don't need to have that kind of position or need to have the kind of title that I think I do in order to feel fulfilled myself.
Mhm. Yeah. You also bring up a really good point too, that sometimes the small tweaks that we can make in our job is looking at like, what are the things that really light us up and bring us, like when we're doing that particular task or type of work that really energize us. And then there's the tasks that literally feel like it's sucking the soul out of you. And being able to work with coworkers and or your boss and figure out like, okay, these are the things that I really enjoy and that like light me up and I'm good at doing, and almost like trading off with other people that maybe like the thing that you don't like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, something that can be a really important lever for affecting change in your current job. I think a lot of us have this habit of projecting ourselves onto other people. We assume that other people see the world in the same ways as us. We also often assume that people find the same things easy that we do or difficult that we do. We might also think that people have the same interests as us, but that often ends up not being true. And so a lot of times at work, I could think of examples of files that I was working on where you sort of talk to a colleague and you realize that they're super interested in something, and then you can maybe trade it with them because it's a total drag to you. Whereas, something with you could find the opposite situation with them. Okay, look, I can help you out with this thing because, it's something that I find pretty interesting, or I like working with the person who's on the other end of that, or I did something similar in the past, so it'd be a little bit easier for me. And so figuring out ways to trade off with other people can make life easier for everyone. It can be a win-win.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some of the other, like you talk about, the small tweaks that we can make in our jobs? What are some other tweaks that you would help your clients to make?
Well, a big one, so something that takes a lot of energy away from people and something that people struggle with a lot is dealing with difficult colleagues. And so one tweak that people can make is often really figuring out, okay, well, how do I adjust those relationships? So one example that I have in mind is a doctor that I was coaching, and she had a lot of issues dealing with the finance team at the hospital that she was working in. It was for a pretty simple reason, right? She really, she would go into these meetings and they would just suck all the energy out of her because she felt like she was always battling with these people who didn't at all share her values, didn't see the world that she saw it. And from her perspective, she was totally focused on patient care and making sure that her patients got the best possible care, whereas the finance people were all just focused on money and how to get the patients in and out of the door very quickly.
You're
And so
speaking to my heart right now.
and so these meetings were really draining, right? Because there was animosity underneath, there was a lot of tension, and it basically just made her unhappy to see these people. And so we actually spent a lot of time discussing, okay, well, one of the questions that I asked her was, okay, well, how do you think that your finance colleagues respond to their kids at the end of the day when they ask what they did and why they do it? And we started thinking about, how they might frame their job to other people. And what came out of this discussion was that, well, they actually probably see their job as helping patient care as well, because obviously we're talking about this. So I have the good fortune of living in a country where we have a public healthcare system, and you don't really have to worry about profit margins and everything. But in the US, at least, right, you really have to make sure that the hospital is solvent, and you can't care for any patients at all unless the hospital actually exists. So we thought about ways in which, okay, maybe these people aren't just blood-sucking finance people who are focused on extracting every possible dollar out of the patient. Maybe actually their concern is making sure that the hospital is running effectively so that they can direct the right resources to the right patients. And at the end of the day, maybe they're actually focused on patient care as well, and helping her to see these situations from their perspective helped to unblock things, because it meant that they weren't always fighting about everything. It meant that she got to pick her battles a little bit more. It made the relationship with these people a little bit more fluid because, again, she was able to see them more as human beings and not just as, okay, I have to disagree with everything that they say. And it just made the relationship in general more pleasant. So she was actually able to look forward to these meetings instead of dreading them. And so I think that's a really good example of really figuring out how you can change your perspective on your colleagues, putting yourself into their shoes in order to be able to alleviate some of the pain points of those relationships.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about like emotional intelligence and how important that is in the work environment. I kind of hear two things in that. One is the self-awareness, where you're looking at how am I reacting to this? What are the feelings that this situation or these particular people are causing me? But then also it's the looking at somebody's perspective and then bringing in that empathy to understand, what maybe they're dealing with, and seeing it that you're right. They probably do see it as we're providing better patient care. We just may not agree maybe on how we're getting to that point, but then taking the time to understand, okay, like let me shift and look from your lens. How are you seeing this?
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of things here that are really important to keep in mind. First of all, you are never going to change your colleagues. You can hope that they will change, and maybe they will if you're lucky, but it's always going to be easier to change your outlook and change your habits to adapt to your colleagues than the other way around.
Yeah.
It's a hard truth, but it's basically a fact. Obviously with all of the sort of caveats about, if you're in a situation where someone's harassing you or something, you shouldn't have to put up with that. But, in normal situations, it's more effective to try to figure out ways to adapt your own behavior. And the second thing to keep in mind is that it's exhausting to stay angry at people, right? I understand there are situations where you want to feel righteous about, okay, this person did me wrong and, oh, this person is always doing this thing and it's so disrespectful, but you waste so much energy doing that. It's always better to try to figure out ways to sort of let go a little bit. And one of those things to help you let go is, again, putting yourself in their shoes, being able to see things from the other perspective, but also it's as simple as just taking a step back and reminding yourself again, look, this person's a human being, thinking about all the different justifications for their behavior. Okay, yeah, maybe they behaved really inappropriately, again, within the bounds of, normalcy and not harassment and stuff. Maybe they behaved inappropriately, but look, it could be because they had a terrible day. Maybe they had a fight with their partner when they woke up in the morning. Maybe they're experiencing health problems or something. Maybe they just got yelled at by a client, a boss. So just as much as possible and within reason, giving people the benefit of the doubt just to help you alleviate that stress and anger, because it takes a lot of energy to carry that around.
Yeah, I think that's so important because I think that that's something too that a lot of times we almost like dehumanize our coworkers. We forget that they're human. And while they may have traits or habits that aren't necessarily ideal in our perspective, they're still a human. And for the most part, probably a good human being. It's just that maybe they do things that just irk us a little bit. And sometimes you have to look at that from the perspective of like, how is this really that important that it's going to cause this much of a upset in my world? Is it really affecting me to that level? And just kind of getting a little bit of space from it, I think.
Yeah, and also reminding yourself that whatever they're doing, it's probably not personal.
Yes.
Even if it seems directed at you, maybe they don't know that you hate the sound of them clicking their pen all the time, right? Maybe they don't even realize they're, doing that annoying thing. And so just reminding yourself that, okay, look, it's probably not directed at me. I think that helps a lot because a lot of that anger can come from you feeling like you're personally targeted.
Yeah. In fact, I just kind of dealt with this last week with one of my coworkers. She was kind of complaining about some of their coworkers and think like this rift between them. And I was talking to her and I said, you have to remember that what people say and do is about them and how you respond to it is about you. And she would like, just even when she took that perspective on, it was like, it shifted everything for her. The other thing to keep in mind too, is that if you always assume positive intention out of people, it takes a lot of the animosity out of things. People aren't doing things on purpose to be vicious or to be annoying or, whatever. So I think those are both, just really good perspectives to kind of keep in mind with coworkers. And you're very right. You can't bring self-awareness into somebody else. Like that has to be a decision that they make for themselves to become more self-aware and look at how am I showing up in this environment.
Mhm.
I guess in a sense too, if you worked through all of these and you've tried all of these like tactics and the environment is still not something that you feel like you're able to thrive in, what would be your recommendation, your advice, or like what would be the next step you would take with that person?
Well, so I guess, first of all, I think, we'd spend, it takes a fair bit of time, I guess, to go through all of this, right? So, thinking about, okay, what are my values? What's really important to me? How do I bring my job as much as possible into alignment with these values that I have? And then, thinking about what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? How do I, again, make sure I align my job as much with that? And then again, going through this idea of, coworkers and everything. Then I guess maybe another place to really look is thinking about, I guess, self-confidence. What are things that maybe we're worried about? What are what might we be nervous that our colleagues think we might be judging us on, or what might we think that our clients might be judging us on? Um, Delving into that a little bit and figuring out how to develop some skills that might be developed, or even just uh, explore a little bit more to shore up a bit of self-confidence, to be a little bit more secure into what we're doing. That can also help us to be a lot happier in the job that we're working in, because a lot of the unhappiness that we might have might be just because of these things that we're nervous about. And here I'm thinking again about those people who tend to go home from work at the end of the day and are just thinking about work all the time, because it's these issues that are hanging over people's head. They tend to be long-term things that tend to gnaw at us.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so being able to figure out ways to feel more secure in the job that we have can help us to let go a little bit more at the end of the day. And that can bring us into a situation where we feel like I have a little bit of more work-life balance.
I'm curious, are you kind of touching almost on imposter syndrome with that?
Yeah, I think that's a huge thing. Exactly. Because if we feel like we're in a job that we don't belong in, or if we're constantly worried that someone might, uh, discover us as having been some sort of fraud, and we got there by accident, then of course that's going to be a huge source of stress,
Yeah.
and of course that's going to prevent us from being able to focus on some things that might give us a lot of pleasure in our job, might also distract us from being able to develop certain aspects of our career that might bring us a lot more satisfaction that we might not even really be thinking about.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, touching too on, the worrying or thinking about work after the fact, I think a lot of dissatisfaction with people's jobs comes from burnout, um, which I'm sure there's, again, a multitude of causes for burnout, but I think one of them is the not having the boundary or the line between work life, personal life.
Mhm.
And that's definitely something that I think comes to a certain choice, like with imposter syndrome and thinking about my performance at work when I come home and worrying about that. That's something personal that I can address and look at. But a lot of jobs now, with our cell phones, with taking laptops home, with especially the remote work that came with COVID, and now people, even though going back into the office, they still have the capability of working from home. There's almost these expectations that we're still like tied in to our jobs, via email, phone, or, hey, can you jump on real quick and do this one thing that's work related in the evening? So what would be uh, your take on that?
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up right after the imposter syndrome bit, because I think it's really connected. I think that when people feel insecure in their jobs, when they're really worried that they might be in a precarious situation, I think that's when they can get taken advantage of, and when they're less likely to be able to put up boundaries, and to let those boundaries become really permeable. So I think uh, figuring out ways to, again, shore up self-confidence, be really comfortable about what our strengths are and where we need to ask for help on things can also help us be more comfortable in setting boundaries, and also being able to understand when we can say no and when we can't say no. Because I think when we're not really secure in what our jobs in why we're good at our jobs, or what people are seeking us out for, I think that it can be hard to distinguish between, okay, what's a real emergency, when do I really have to respond right away, and when I can say, okay, no, this is something that can wait.
Yeah. I mean, I think about healthcare a lot. I know a lot of the burnout for healthcare workers comes from being on call, which is kind of just part of the deal for the most part. But it's one of those requirements that it's not going to go away. Like, this is something we just have to deal with in the job, is that's just a part of it. But it can lead to burnout, because you are, even when you leave the hospital, if you're on call that night, you're still attached by that phone, kind of, waiting for it to maybe go off. And it causes, like, some anxiety outside of work. And it's very hard, even on the nights that you're not on call, to kind of release that, right? Because you're bouncing in and out of that, like, window of tolerance almost. So in those instances where you can't really lay a boundary, because it is a aspect of the job that you just have to accept, where would somebody go from there?
Well, I guess it's really just a matter of figuring out the small areas in which you do have some kind of control, right? How can you figure out to adapt that situation to make it as comfortable as possible for you. I mean, look, it's a different situation with most. So the vast majority of my clients are lawyers, and so lawyers, there's not necessarily a situation in which they're on call in the same sense that it's literally a life or death situation where you have to respond. But lawyers do often feel like they have to be available all the time. And I think this is a situation where, again, so there's the boundary piece, which I just addressed, but there's also another piece of thinking about, okay, what does it mean to be good at my job? Okay, so you've given this healthcare example, and of the being on call, but maybe let's think about kind of other situations that are slightly analogous to that, and really thinking about, okay, so what does it mean to be good at my job? There's not necessarily just one way of being good at my job and one way of demonstrating that I'm good at my job. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. And this is a situation where tweaks can come in as well. Because if we just assume that there's only one way to be good at our job and we have to be like everybody else, then we can start to set unreasonable expectations for ourselves that, again, might not match up with who we are or what we excel at. And so what I'm thinking about in the context of lawyers is reactivity. And the fact of the matter is, not everybody has to be super reactive all the time. You don't necessarily have to respond to every email right away. You don't always have to pick up the phone when it's ringing. Getting comfortable with what your value add is, which might not be your reactivity, it might be something else, and being able to leverage that as much as possible can also be a way of regaining a little bit control and feeling like your job is a little bit more adapted to your specific situation.
So I'm curious, like, the tie-in between imposter syndrome and the burnout here. So the people that are continuing to work, or like Johnny on the spot answering emails or phone calls in their personal time, do you look at that as like they're trying to outperform to make up for where maybe they feel they're lacking in their skill level? Is that kind of the connection that you're making there?
I think that's part of it. So part of it is definitely, so something I hear a lot from clients is, oh, by the way, I have to work 10 times as hard in order to get the same results. I have to work 10 times as many hours to get the same work product that a lot of my colleagues do. Clearly, if everybody is saying that to me, that can't really be true. But I think another aspect of it is just putting more pressure on ourselves than is necessary because we feel like maybe we're not as good as everybody else. And so one way of trying to do that is to always be super reactive, or always be available, or always say yes, never say no, because maybe we're worried that if we don't respond right away, then someone else will, or if we don't respond right away, then maybe someone will start questioning our skills. Or if we are not super available all the time, then someone will turn to someone else to answer the question, any number of those things.
That all makes sense. I mean, I'm even thinking like in my line of work, there's people that, definitely have better technical skills than others. And I can see a lot of that possibly being the reason why they're the ones that always take the call. They're the ones that always pick up the extra shifts, because it's like they're trying to almost fill a need, knowing that maybe they're not as confident in their technical skills. So it's like, well, I'm going to make up for that in this other area by being available all the time. In that sense, I can definitely see that being a possibility.
And that brings up another really important point, actually. And it's sort of related to what we were talking about earlier with, okay, are maybe there tasks that you're working on that you really dislike and that you might be able to switch with another colleague. It's being comfortable asking other people for help.
Yeah.
And there are a few layers to this, and some of it's related to imposter syndrome as well, right? So if you have imposter syndrome, you might think, goodness, I can't ask anyone for help because it's going to reveal this weakness that I have. I have to show to everyone that I'm really comfortable in all of these different areas. But the fact of the matter is, asking other people for help can really be a sign of strength, in the sense that you're comfortable admitting when you have some lacunae in your skills. And you also understand when you need to reach out to other resources that are available in order to really maximize the team effort that's going on wherever you're working. So having the confidence and having the wisdom to be able to reach out to people and say, hey, look, can you either help me out with this? Or look, I noticed that you're really good at this thing that I could really use a bit of help on. Can you explain to me how you do it? Or can you show me how you do it? And that can be a huge help, because then it means that you can get a little bit more confident with your skills. Maybe you'll learn something that you didn't know before. The other person will probably feel really good because they had the opportunity to help you out. And maybe it even helps them with their skills as well, because in explaining something to you or showing you how to do something, it actually reinforces their own skills.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great way to look at it. So when you think about, like, if somebody was out there is experiencing this like dissatisfaction with their job, I think coaching obviously is a fantastic tool that you can use to get more clarity around this and work through it. That is a longer process. We kind of talked about this before we jumped on to recording, that, coaching isn't like this one and done. Let's have a coaching session and you're going to have all the answers about how to fix your job. This is a process. So I'm just kind of wondering, if you look at the process that you take your clients through, kind of like, what are the action steps or the path that you follow? And everybody's path, of course, is going to be a little bit different, but the framework maybe that you use with them.
Yeah. So I guess taking a step back and thinking about the preface that I gave to our discussion today. So, a lot of times people come to me, they say, look, I've had it, I need to leave my job. And one of the things I said at the beginning of this podcast was, look, the bad news is that many of the problems that you're experiencing are probably going to follow you around. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that a lot of the issues that we might be experiencing at work, and maybe even most of them that we're unhappy with, aren't 100% the fault of the job we're in, the circumstances we're in, but they have a lot to do with ourselves as well. So, we touched on some things like imposter syndrome or lack of confidence, which means it's hard to set boundaries. Maybe it's also other things in terms of simply how we get along with colleagues. Maybe it's also just the way that we work, how efficient we are, how we organize our day. And so the first step is really thinking about, okay, before you take the nuclear option of leaving and finding something else, is thinking about, okay, look, how do I give this job my best possible chances? And worst case scenario, you've made all these tweaks, and that's going to help you have the strongest possible start in a future job. Yeah. So that's kind of the background thought that should, sort of preface everything. Then what you have to think about is, okay, now this job that you have is your giant field of experimentation. So, if you're already at the point where you think, okay, maybe I want to leave, then the stakes suddenly become a little bit lower for experimenting things. You can start tweaking things. You can start maybe asking things of people that can try to get you closer to where you want. And again, the worst case scenario is kind of basically where you started out. So it's thinking about, okay, what are all the different ways that I think I can experiment in order to be able to get where I need to go? So a good starting point like we were saying, is thinking about, okay, what are my interests? What are my values? What really gets me excited? So paying attention to all of those things, try to get some data. And then once you've done some really rigorous thinking around that, then you can start figuring out what your experiments are going to be in order to try to get yourself there. And the important thing with this is to be systematic and also to be rigorous and analytical. So start out by tweaking one thing, try it out for a little while, spend some time to reflect and say, okay, look, how did that go? Okay, what was the change that I make? What was the impact of that? Was the impact positive? If yes, then how do I continue to do that to make sure that I keep this positive momentum? If it didn't work, what might have been the things about it that didn't work? And what do I need to adjust about that to try to make it work in the future? And then if that's the case, then you go for round two and you keep going like that.
It's almost like an A/B testing as you kind of work through the different tweaks that you're trying. I'm kind of curious too, like, do you let your clients set the metrics for what they consider better or an improvement? Like some people, maybe how they feel about work or how they feel when they're at work. Others may see the metric as like, I have a better relationship with my coworkers, and that's the metric that I use. Do you let them kind of define that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Coaching is 100% client driven. So it's never my job to say, this is what you should be looking for. This is how we should measure things. And we spend a fair bit of time at the beginning of a coaching relationship saying, okay, what are your signs of success? And what are going to be the indications that you get there? So, you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about some things there. Sometimes for some people, it's how I feel. So that could be, man, what do I feel like when I wake up in the morning? Am I excited to go to work? It might be, how do I feel at the end of the day? Am I drained? It might be, how many times a day do I look at the clock? How many times a day do I take a break and read the newspaper? How many times a day do I, get up and start talking to colleagues versus, how long can I stay focused on the task at hand? For other people, it's going to be indicators of how much output I have, or what are my interactions with certain colleagues? How much positive feedback am I getting from people? How often is so-and-so smiling at me? What's the frequency with which someone's giving me negative feedback? How many times does someone have to return a work product with me with revisions before it's actually passed off in the final product? It's, could be any number of indicators.
Mm-hmm. And the reflection process, do you do that in the coaching sessions, or is that something that you kind of have them do independently, where they, you're going back and you're looking at like, okay, how did today look, or how did maybe like the last week look? Are you doing that in a dialogue way, or is this something like journaling, like a self-reflection practice?
Yes. So most of my clients are heinously busy. So a lot of them don't, wouldn't necessarily have the time to, go do journaling and stuff like that. So a lot of this happens so it's really important for everyone to do the reflective work in between coaching sessions on a continuous basis, but it doesn't necessarily have to be written or anything. And so that reflective work tends to happen in a coaching session. So, a really classic thing is to end a coaching session with some kind of action plan. Okay, here's what I'm going to put into practice. And then when we have the next coaching session, it's usually a couple of weeks later, then do that analysis together of how did it work? What did you end up putting into place? How did it go? What worked? What didn't? And kind of doing a lot of digging around that to figure out if they can move on to something else, or if they need to stick with that and try some other solutions.
Revise the hypothesis.
Yeah.
So with the values, I'm always curious about this because I think a lot of coaches do this in a very different method. Some people will just give people a list of values and say, go through this, and the ones that speak to you, pull them out, and those are your core values. How do you go about helping a client find out what their values are?
I think a really important question is asking about people that they admire. So it could be family members, it could be friends, it could be colleagues, and thinking about, okay, why do you admire that person's career? What do you think went well for them? Why do you think that the life that they're living is representative of a good life? What is it that's ideal about that? Asking questions around those people and really doing some digging once they are able to come up with a couple of examples can be a really rich source of information for what people's values really are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like to, a lot of times, I think looking at the negative side of things, like in situations where you felt, triggered or upset about the way the situation goes, what was it about that situation that like didn't feel right to you, and what value maybe was being not served well in that instance? I think sometimes is a good way to look at what are the things that are important to you.
Mhm.
And in the work environment, how do you help your clients to live out their values in their work environment, because their values may be very different than the values of the corporation, of the company, even obviously of your coworkers may share very different values. So how in that sense can they honor their values if it's not maybe that match up?
Yeah, well, I think this goes back to the discussion we were talking about, these micro adjustments that you can make in your job. I think that there are ways that you can figure out that, even if globally a job might seem like a mismatch, a lot of times when you zoom in, you can figure out ways to really live out things that are really important to you. So, earlier I gave you the example of people who, I was talking about people who discover they have a passion for management. I think that if people are really focused on a human element, they can find ways to mentor younger colleagues, or otherwise find ways to improve office culture, again, even on a really, really small basis. I guess something that I'm thinking about is that if I'm having so human connection is something that's really important to me.
Mhm.
If I'm having a bad day, something that can improve my mood is really just figuring out small ways that I can kind of improve other people's days. And that can be something as simple as you go to the store and some person who's helping you is frowning, and then figuring out, sort of even something as simple as smiling at them until they smile back. Seeing that you have that small impact on someone can create that human connection, and improve your day as a result. So when I'm talking about improving if the human aspect is important to you, you don't necessarily have to be in a management position to be able to have that kind of impact. So it's figuring out even those tiny ways of uh, creating the environment that you want and living out the values that you have can be really important and can make a bigger difference, in a fairly big difference in your experience at work.
Yeah. And this may tie into kind of the conversation that we had at the beginning around your coachee that was in a doctor, and having that disparity between her and like the financial team. And I hear this a lot from people that are unhappy in their jobs, is that they feel as if either their company or maybe even the industry that they're in is out of integrity. And integrity is a value that they hold very close.
Mhm.
So how would you handle that situation?
So I think that there are a few different options, right? So we talked about really focusing on the micro scale. So maybe again, when you zoom out on the macro scale, there maybe is a mismatch in values, but maybe within your team, there are ways for you to live out that value of integrity or what have you. And so thinking about ways to really focus on that smaller scale and make small scale change. Uh, I think also just reframing can be a useful exercise as well, and thinking about, okay, look, this is one way to look at the company that I'm working for, but maybe if I look at it from a different perspective, that could change things a little bit. And again, I guess that does go, back to that example of the finance team, like I was talking about. Like, it's a pretty, depending on what your values are, right? It might be easy for you to pick out that finance team as an easy target um, for criticism. But again, when you really look at it from another perspective, when you look at it from a systems perspective, it might be a little bit easier for you to see things a different way.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So kind of just to tie things up here a little bit, but I'm thinking about the people who maybe are about to, like, maybe they're looking for a different job, same industry, just maybe about to go into a different job, or they're relocating and they're, looking for work. What do you think are some important questions or things that people need to look at when they're in the interview process, to look at, is this company, corporation, this particular place going to be a good fit for me? Is this a place that I can flourish?
I think it's really important to speak to people beyond who you're just interviewing with, right? So work your contacts and find out who you can get in touch with to get a sense of what the company's like, and if possible, what the team is like, to see how they operate, what the culture's like, what their values are, what the rhythm of life is like. The questions that you ask are totally going to depend on what your life is like and what's important to you. For some people, the kind of hours that you work, the stress that you have are going to be really important. For other people, things that are much more important are going to be the kind of the subject matter that you're working on, or the kind of impact that you have. So, yeah, it's going to totally depend on person to person, but I think it's really important to get a perspective beyond just the people that are interviewing you, also so that you can have a more impartial view, because it's hard to have it's basically impossible to have a candid conversation within the context of the interview process, right? So being able to get other sources of information, I think, is really important.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, Jon, is there anything else that you can think of that you want to touch on in this arena?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really good information, I think, for people to take into consideration moving forward. And I think that you're absolutely right. I think that definitely making some of these smaller tweaks can make a pretty big difference in our day-to-day work experience. And it is, I think, worth the effort to see if we can improve the situation, improve the job that we're in, so that we're not, having to start over brand new. You mentioned something to me, again, before we recorded, that you did take the nuclear option, and you're like, I wish maybe that I would have done some of these tweaks in hindsight. And I'm a little bit curious about, like, when you think about that, what would you have done differently before taking the option just to leave law completely and go into executive coaching?
I just wish that I had taken more time, set aside a little bit more time, or set aside any time every week to really focus on, because I had a very clear idea of what my weak spots were and what I needed to develop. I wish that I had taken more time to, set aside time each week to really develop those things, and really explore that, and make sure that I'd taken that all the way before I made the decision to switch.
Yeah. Do you think maybe going into a different area of law would have made a difference?
No, it was funny. I was actually having lunch with a couple of former colleagues today, and it was really funny because at some point at the end of the lunch, a legal discussion came up, and I was just like, I could even feel a tightness in my chest. Didn't I just didn't love the kind of the kind of questions that I was dealing with, and it, it just didn't really fulfill me at all. I think, look, I think my situation was also very different than a lot of people's situation, in that I went to law school mostly because I thought, okay, this is going to be a great springboard to being able to move to a different country, because it was I was working in a field that was fairly exportable, and I had a skill set that I knew would be valued on a lot of markets. And so, it was very much a sort of calculated decision, sort of means to an end. And it was also kind of the classic, look, I'm not really sure what I want to do, so I'll go to law school kind of thing, which is, obviously not what I recommend to most people. So I think that my situation was definitely unique in a lot of respects. And the thing that was nice about my job eventually was that it actually did give me the time and space to think about, what I really enjoyed about my job, what I didn't. And, I can't remember if I said this, before we started the podcast recording or after, but, I had the time in that job to think about, okay, what is it that I really like about my job? What is it that I really don't? And I realized that I could keep all the things that I liked and get rid of all the things that I didn't, while doing coaching. And that's very much in line with what I'm talking about today, in the sense that, in 99% of cases, in most people's jobs, you really should be able to, with these tweaks that we're talking about, create the job that's much more in line with what you want to do, craft that position for yourself so that you are able to stay there and really enjoy it without having to make drastic decisions.
Yeah. You bring up another interesting point, and we don't necessarily have to address this in this podcast, but speaking back when you were getting ready to go into law school, I think a lot of kids today that are at that precipice of life of like figuring out what do I want to do. There is this kind of pressure situation where it's like, okay, the time has come that you have to go off to college. And you have to decide what is the thing that I want to do for the rest of my life. And they are making decisions sometimes from like a value system that is more their parents' values or the group of people that they surrounded themselves with. They haven't necessarily identified their personal true values yet. And also going along with the idea of like, well, I'm going to pick a career that's going to be lucrative, or it's going to be something that I can take anywhere, no matter where I go, whether that be across, different states or different countries. And so I think too that, and we have this idea that it's like, once I pick it, I have to stick with it for the rest of my life kind of thing. So having been in that situation, what would be your advice to somebody who's at that point in their life where they're about to embark on the career path, a certain line of study or profession, for them to kind of look at before they make that decision of this is what I want to pursue in life?
Wait, I guess it's just like the highlight what we were talking about before in terms of don't fall into that passion narrative. Don't feel like you need to find that thing that you're passionate about, or also don't necessarily think that that thing that I'm passionate about necessarily has to become my career. But I think I would also give people a slightly different warning because, I got into a situation, and I know some other people that got into a similar situation where you just keep doing something because you're really good at it. And you think, okay, since I'm really good at it, this is what I should be doing. Whereas you really should think more about, okay, focus from as early a stage as possible to think about, okay, what is it that I enjoy doing, which might not necessarily map on with the thing that you're best at, and try to figure out how to move in that direction.
So a lawyer may be somebody who likes to argue and is good at arguing, or did debate team in high school and loved the conflict of that. So that maybe they're good at it, but that is still saying that maybe being a lawyer isn't the path for you if it doesn't light you up, if you're not gaining energy from those things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the distinction I would draw, because you said, someone who really enjoyed being on the debate team, maybe, I do something, I went to undergrad with someone who did love being on the debate team, and she's now partnered at a big law firm, and, I'm sure that she really loves what she's doing. So yeah, that did give her energy, but maybe there's someone on the debate team who is really good at it, but maybe they still dread it a little bit. Maybe that's a big warning sign.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we get the messages when we are good at things and people tell us, oh, you're so good at this, you should be at this because you're so good at that. We start to kind of take those messages in, instead of actually looking at ourselves. Yes, I know that I'm good at this, but it doesn't really give me the energy. This is not something I want to do day in, day out for the rest of my life, moving forward. And I think it's also important to say too, that just because you pursue one path, if you get into it 10 years down the line, there is nothing really stopping you from saying, I changed my mind. I want to pursue a different path. And I think what the work that you do with your clients, as far as making the tweaks to try to make the job work for them, in the instance, I think where it just isn't working for them, it isn't the thing that's for them. And there does need to be that transition. I feel like we need to normalize that a little bit more, that it is okay to change our minds, and decide to pursue something different at really, honestly, any age of life.
Yeah. And also to pick up on something that I said earlier, that there is more than one way to be good at a job, that, no job is 100% monolithic. And so helping people to think a little bit more outside the box of, okay, this is what my image is of a perfect doctor or a perfect lawyer, but maybe that doesn't really align with who I am. Maybe there's another way to do that, I think is an important thing to keep in mind.
Absolutely. All right, Jon. Well, if people want to learn more about you or get in contact with you around the work that you do, where would they find you?
So I have a website. It's www.passaro-coaching.com. So PASSARO-coaching.com. I'm sure you can put it up on, whatever site that the podcast is on. So that's definitely the best way to find me.
Okay, awesome. And so I last season wrapped up with 3 random questions. And at the end of each episode. And we definitely hit a wall because I asked you what your favorite word was. And you're like, how do you pick one word? Which was
I do
funny
remember
because
stumbling on the questions.
and later on, Lauren interviewed me and she's like, what's your favorite book? And I'm like, you can't just pick one book as a favorite book. Like there's so many good books. So I definitely got that backhanded at me. So the question that I would ask you is, when I offer the phrase to thrive in life, what comes up for you?
So for me, thriving in life is really enjoying almost every moment as it comes and not putting off things until later. It's really having the impression that your life is big and full at almost every possible moment, and that you are giving out things that make you feel like you're being very generous, and you get back things that make you feel like you're really fulfilled.
Love that. That's great. All right, Jon. Well, thank you so much. And I'm always going to keep the opportunity open for another episode. I feel like there's always stuff for us to talk about, but thanks for taking the time today and coming on and talking about this super important topic.
Yeah, thank you. It was a really interesting conversation. So yeah, I'd love to come back sometime.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Jon.
Thank you.